You know, when you step into a doctor's office with like a physical ailment, there is this underlying expectation of precision.
Right. Like you want a clear answer.
Exactly. You break your arm, the doctor puts you in an x-ray machine, the film goes up on the light board, and boom, there it is. A jagged white line across the bone.
It's undeniable.
Yeah, the doctor just points and says, there's the problem. And it's clean, it's binary, and honestly, I mean, it's incredibly comforting because you can actually see the break. You know exactly what needs to be fixed.
It's a very satisfying process.
It really is. But when you step into the world of spiritual health, into the deep and honestly often unsearchable recesses of the human heart, well, that x-ray machine is completely useless.
Oh, totally useless. Yeah.
We are looking at a diagnostic landscape that is entirely murky. It's incredibly difficult to read because, you know, spiritual diseases don't usually present as obvious fractures. More often than not, they actually present as perfect health.
Which is terrifying, right?
It is. So, welcome to Reformed Thinking. Today we are wading directly into those diagnostic muddy waters. We're doing a deep dive into a message delivered way back on May 13th, 1855 at Exeter Hall, Strand.
A classic.
Truly, by the legendary Charles H. Spurgeon, and it's titled A Caution to the Presumptuous. And he essentially, he built a spiritual x-ray machine to spot a disease that looks exactly like robust faith.
And what is truly remarkable about this particular x-ray machine is that it was operated by a guy who was, I mean, he was only 20 years old at the time.
Which is just wild to think about.
It's crazy. When Spurgeon delivered this at Exeter Hall, he was speaking to this massive packed-out crowd in London, and yet the precision with which he dissects the human condition, it reads like he was diagnosing the modern mind just this morning.
Yeah, it doesn't feel dated at all.
Not at all. And the foundational text he uses to anchor this entire, well, this architectural masterpiece of a sermon is 1 Corinthians 10:12, which says, "Let him that thinketh he standeth take heed lest he fall." Yeah, it is a text that, on its surface, feels like a sudden jolt to the system, especially given the theological framework he is preaching from.
Right, and that is the exact tension we have to navigate here.
Yeah.
Because as believers who hold firmly to the doctrines of grace, we have this profound, beautiful reliance on the eternal security of the believer.
Absolutely.
Like the preservation of the saints is a bedrock comfort for us. If God has regenerated your heart, if he has saved you, he will keep you, period.
The grip of Christ is unyielding.
Unyielding, exactly.
Right.
But then, you know, you turn the page of your New Testament and you hit this intense, blazing apostolic warning from Paul, a direct warning about falling. And the human mind naturally recoils and asks, well, how do we reconcile the unshakable eternal security of the believer with this severe warning sign that says, take heed lest you fall?
It is the absolute definition of a theological paradox. And it's one that, frankly, often makes people really uncomfortable.
Oh, for sure.
We tend to want to resolve the paradox by just abandoning one side of it. I mean, we either lean so far into the warning that we lose all our assurance and we just live in this constant, terrifying state of works righteousness.
Wondering if we're going to lose our salvation today.
Right, exactly. Or we flip it and lean so far into the doctrine of security that we completely ignore the warning. We just brush it off as something that applies to other people.
Like it's only for the unelect.
Yeah, exactly. But Spurgeon doesn't step away from his Reformed convictions here to accommodate the warning. He leans entirely into them.
Which is brilliant.
It really is. The Reformed understanding is that God ordains not just the end, so our final salvation, but he also ordains the means to that end. And one of the primary means God uses to keep his people from falling is by issuing these terrifying warnings about falling.
So the warning does the work.
Yes. True grace doesn't produce a careless slumber. It produces a holy vigilance. The warning itself is the instrument of preservation.
That completely reframes the warning, doesn't it? From a threat into an act of divine mercy. And that really brings us to the core of what we need to examine in our own hearts today, because the distance between true God-given assurance, which is this beautiful stabilizing force, and the incredibly dangerous, subtle counterfeit of presumption, well, that distance is vastly wide on paper.
Oh, on paper, sure.
But experientially, on a Tuesday afternoon when you're just, living your life, they can feel terrifyingly similar.
They really can.
So to understand why a believer might experience a severe moral or spiritual collapse, we first have to understand the mechanics of the deception itself. Like, how exactly are we tricked into thinking we are perfectly safe when we are actually standing on the precipice of a disaster?
Spurgeon tackles that exact question by introducing what I think is just one of his most brilliant and enduring metaphors. He talks about the counterfeit mint.
The counterfeit mint. I love this.
Yeah, he starts by challenging our fundamental assumption about the nature of evil. Because we usually think of vice and virtue as just polar opposites, right? Like black and white or fire and water.
Right, like they're just fighting each other directly.
Exactly. We think if you want to destroy a virtue, you just introduce its opposite. But Spurgeon argues that Satan is a far more sophisticated strategist than that. He operates a counterfeiting operation.
Because if the enemy of your soul just came at you with pure, unadulterated evil, I mean, you would see it coming a mile away.
You'd spot it instantly.
Right. If he tried to replace your faith with outright, blatant atheism, your defenses would immediately go up. But a counterfeit bypasses the defense system because it mimics the very thing you are actually supposed to be protecting.
Exactly. That's the danger. Spurgeon describes God sending a precious coin of genuine metal down from the mint of heaven. And this coin has the king's image and superscription beautifully stamped on it. It's pure, it's weighty, it's incredibly valuable. But then Satan sees this good thing circulating in the spiritual economy, and instead of trying to confiscate it or destroy it outright, he goes into his own mint. He takes base metal from the bottomless pit, he meticulously imitates the heavenly stamp, and he passes off a vile, worthless production as if it were the genuine article. He just floods the market with bad currency.
And Spurgeon gives us these incredible rapid-fire examples from the text to prove this point, showing how these counterfeits operate in our daily lives.
Right.
So first he points out that God gives love, which is his very nature, the essence of the Christian ethic.
Right.
But Satan fashions a counterfeit thing, stamps the word love on the side of it, but the metal is actually lust.
Which is so deceptive.
It is, because in the very early stages of human emotion, they can look and feel incredibly similar. They both involve, intense desire, fixation, a drive for connection.
Very true.
But their substance is entirely different. One is entirely self-giving, and the other is entirely self-consuming.
And then he moves right from love to courage. God bestows genuine courage upon his people. This is that holy fortitude to look your fellow man in the face, completely fearless in doing your moral duty, regardless of the consequences.
Yeah, true bravery.
But Satan fires up his mint and inspires a counterfeit, which is mere foolhardiness. It's styled as courage, society applauds it as courage, but it merely bids a man to rush to the cannon's mouth for what Spurgeon calls bubble reputation.
Bubble reputation. That phrasing is just so sharp.
It's perfect.
Because it looks iridescent and large for a moment, but it's completely hollow. It pops the second real pressure is applied. Yeah. And he doesn't stop there. He talks about holy fear, that reverent, trembling awe of God's majesty.
A very necessary virtue.
Absolutely. And Satan counterfeits this with unbelief. We so often mistake our own lack of trust in God's promises, like our own anxiety and doubt, for a humble, holy fear. We think we're being pious by doubting if God could really love us, when actually we are just handling the counterfeit coin of unbelief. Okay, let's unpack this, because all of these smaller coins lead up to the main event. This is the grand counterfeit that this entire deep dive hinges on.
Right. This is the ultimate target of the counterfeiter. Spurgeon argues that God gives the saving grace of faith, and when that faith ripens to its full maturity, it becomes confidence, full assurance.
Which is a beautiful thing.
It is. He is very explicit here that there is nothing so comfortable, nothing so desirable to the Christian as the full assurance of faith. But Satan sees this incredibly valuable, beautiful coin of assurance. He takes the slag from the pit, imitates the stamp, and palms upon the believer the deadly vice of presumption.
This sounds exactly like the mechanics of a modern deepfake.
Oh, that's a great comparison.
Right. Think about a highly sophisticated video deepfake you might see online. It looks exactly like the real person. The facial micro-expressions are right, the cadence of the voice is perfectly synthesized, the mannerisms are spot on.
Yeah, you can't even tell.
If you're just scrolling past, you are completely 100% convinced that you are looking at the genuine article. But its underlying source code is entirely deceptive. It was generated by an adversarial network designed specifically to fool your perception. So how does a believer tell the difference between the deepfake of presumption and true, healthy assurance? Because Spurgeon is heavily emphasizing that he isn't attacking strong faith here, right?
No, not at all.
He doesn't want people to leave the room doubting their salvation.
That is a vital distinction, and I think it really shows his pastoral care. He explicitly states that he won't utter one single word against strong faith. In fact, he says he wishes all the little faiths in the congregation were strong faith.
That's reassuring.
It is. He wants everyone to be able to confidently declare, I know whom I have believed. The diagnostic difference really lies in where the eyes are focused. True, genuine confidence rests purely and entirely on the power and the promises of God. It looks outward at Christ.
Okay, looking outward.
Yes. Presumption, on the other hand, is a fleshly security. It looks inward at the self.
Ah, I see. So true assurance says, I am safe because the architecture of God's grace is unbreakable. But presumption says, I am safe because my personal spiritual balance is flawless.
Exactly. Spurgeon describes this unholy presumption as something that creeps over a Christian like a cold death sleep on the mountaintop. When you have true assurance, it operates like a stimulant. It wakes you up to worship, it drives you to serve, it creates this profound gratitude that results in action.
It makes you alive.
Right. But presumption does the exact opposite. It puts you to sleep so that you freeze to death in the elements. It's the false security that looks at the treacherous mountain pass and ignores the spiritual danger entirely, just thinking, I am strong enough to survive this on my own. I am completely beyond falling.
Wow. And if a believer doesn't recognize which of those two coins is actually sitting in their pocket, they are in profound jeopardy. But knowing what the counterfeit looks like is really only half the battle. We have to figure out how this counterfeit currency gets into our accounts in the first place.
Yeah, where does it come from?
Exactly. How does presumption actually take root in the life of someone who genuinely loves God? And Spurgeon identifies several distinct environmental and internal conditions that serve as the breeding ground for this death sleep. And the first one he points to is something that, honestly, almost all of us actively pursue.
And what's that?
Continued worldly prosperity.
Oh, man. It is incredibly counterintuitive. Because if we are honest, the vast majority of our daily prayers are centered on asking God to give us exactly this. We pray for smooth sailing, for promotions, for our investments to grow, for perfect health for our children, for the absence of conflict.
Right. Lord, bless this new business venture. Heal this lingering sickness. Give us a quiet and prosperous year.
Exactly. We equate uninterrupted success with the blessing and favor of God.
We treat it as the ultimate evidence that we are in right standing with the Almighty.
We really do. And yet Spurgeon looks at that exact scenario, uninterrupted success, and he identifies it as one of the most dangerous, fertile breeding grounds for the deep fake of presumption.
Which is just a huge paradigm shift.
It is. To explain why, he reaches back to an Old Testament agricultural metaphor, referencing the prophet Jeremiah's description of Moab. He says Moab is settled on his lees and has not been emptied from vessel to vessel.
Okay, for anyone listening who doesn't happen to be steeped in the intricacies of first-century Middle Eastern winemaking, what exactly does it mean to be settled on the lees?
Fair question. In ancient winemaking, after the grapes were crushed, the juice was put into these large clay jars to ferment. And during fermentation, all the dead yeast cells, the seeds, the stems, and just the heavy sediment would naturally sink to the bottom of the jar.
Makes sense.
Right. And that thick, bitter sludge at the bottom was called the lees. To refine the wine, the winemaker had to carefully pour the liquid from one vessel into a completely new, clean vessel, leaving the sludge behind.
Okay, so separating the good from the bad.
Exactly.
Yeah.
This agitation, this disruptive transferring process was essential, because if a batch of wine was just left to sit undisturbed on its lees for too long, it would absorb all those bitter flavors of the dead yeast. It would become thick, syrupy, overly sweet, and ultimately it would just be spoiled.
Wow.
So Spurgeon is taking this ancient process and applying it to the human soul. He is arguing that a person who never faces the disruption of affliction is like wine left to sit entirely undisturbed. They become spiritually sluggish, thick, and deeply complacent.
And he paints this incredibly vivid picture of the highly successful 19th century merchant to drive the point home. He calls him the princely Dives, living this absolute ideal of human existence.
The guy who has it all.
Right. And Spurgeon uses this grand, poetic, almost cosmic imagery to describe this man's life. He says this man has the bands of Orion loosed for him and the sweet influence of the Pleiades descending upon him. The winds and the waves seem to act as his personal servants.
Everything goes his way.
Everything. His agricultural lands yield abundantly. His business ventures never fail. He possesses brilliant eyes, perfectly braced nerves, and flawless health. He literally laughs at anxiety and says, "Be gone, dull care." I mean, it sounds like the kind of life everyone is trying to build.
It is the American dream, or, the Victorian dream in his context, fully realized. But Spurgeon drops the hammer on this idealized vision, He says that the natural consequence of this unbroken state of comfort, even for the most devout, sincere Christian who ever breathed, will inevitably be presumption.
The heart just can't handle it.
It can't. The human heart simply cannot handle constant success without eventually saying, I stand. It is a profound theological paradox. We are wired to view afflictions, lost property, sudden job terminations, and even clinical depressions of spirit as absolute curses. We bug God to remove them.
Of course we do.
But Spurgeon makes the bold case that these disruptions, these painful pourings from vessel to vessel, are actually severe divine mercies.
Because it is the affliction that keeps us awake. Spurgeon argues that if we were always, as he phrases it, dandled on the knees of fortune, if we never had a single speck in our sunshine or a bitter drop in our cup, we would become completely intoxicated with our own pleasure.
We lose touch with reality.
Exactly. And he uses this terrifying maritime analogy. He compares the prosperous, comfortable man to a man asleep upon the mast of a ship. And just think about the physics of that for a second.
It's crazy.
You are high up in the rigging, balancing on a narrow wooden beam over a churning ocean. Yes, technically, in that exact second you are standing. You are aloft. But you are completely unconscious to the fact that you are in terrible jeopardy every single moment. The slightest roll of the ship, the slightest gust of wind, and you are plunged into the abyss.
That imagery completely flips our modern understanding of hardship on its head. I mean, when you view prosperity as the mast that lulls you to sleep, you suddenly realize that the sudden storm that just wrecked your incredibly comfortable 5-year plan might not be a punishment at all.
Wow.
It might actually be the very thing waking you up, forcing you to grip the wood before you casually roll off into the sea. Prosperity creates the illusion of stability, and that illusion is the exact soil where presumption grows fastest.
But that comfort we've been talking about isn't the only thing that lulls us into this dangerous sleep. There is also this terrifying shift that happens internally, dealing not with our bank accounts or our physical health, but with our actual sensitivity to the world around us.
Right, the internal landscape.
Exactly. Spurgeon moves from prosperity to the gradual numbing of the conscience. He calls it having light thoughts of sin.
And this transition traces a spiritual regression that I think almost everyone listening can instantly identify with, whether they've been a believer for 5 months or 50 years.
Oh, absolutely.
Spurgeon starts by describing the incredibly tender conscience of a brand new convert. When someone is first awakened to the reality of grace and the holiness of God, they're usually terrified of taking a wrong step. They possess this beautiful, holy timidity.
They don't want to mess up.
Exactly. They ask older believers for advice on every little moral dilemma, parsing out how their actions might grieve the Spirit. Spurgeon likens this state to a sensitive plant.
But then time passes. The initial shock of grace wears off, and the surrounding environment begins to exert a steady, abrasive friction against that sensitivity.
Precisely. He notes that the sensitive plant eventually turns into a yielding willow. We grow callous, not overnight, but by imperceptible degrees. The sin that once startled us, the compromise that used to make our blood run cold and keep us up at night repenting, well, eventually it fails to even register on our moral radar.
Here's where it gets really interesting. I think the analogy he uses to explain this psychological shift is one of the most brilliant parts of the entire deep dive. He talks about men working in a shipyard.
Oh, this is such a good one.
It is. He says that when a new worker first steps inside the hull of one of these massive wooden vessels under construction, they're completely overwhelmed. They can't even hold a thought in their head, let alone sleep, because of the continual, deafening, violent din of hundreds of hammers striking wood and metal.
It's just sensory overload.
It's a ringing, physical bombardment of noise, but if you leave that man in that environment for a few months, his brain recalibrates. He gets so profoundly used to the environment that he doesn't even notice the sound anymore. He can literally lay down and take a nap right through the hammering.
Which is just a biological fact.
Right. So think about the spiritual hammering that you might have just quietly adjusted to in your own life. Maybe it's a subtle, ongoing dishonesty in how you report your billable hours at work.
Yeah.
Maybe it's the underlying current of cynicism and passive-aggressive gossip that defines your closest friend group. Or maybe it's the media and the entertainment you consume every single evening that would have deeply horrified you 5 or 10 years ago. You didn't make a conscious decision to abandon your morals. Your brain just slowly adjusted to the noise of the shipyard until the hammering became background music.
What's fascinating here is that the mechanics of this recategorization show that presumption almost never starts with a massive, catastrophic moral failure.
Right, it's not usually a sudden explosion.
No, it's incredibly rare for someone to wake up on a random Tuesday enjoying a healthy walk with God and suddenly decide to completely abandon their faith, dynamite their marriage, and ruin their life. The collapse is always the final step of a long, quiet process.
A slow fade.
Exactly. It starts when we stop viewing sin as a deadly radioactive poison and we start viewing it as a manageable minor nuisance. We develop a theology of little sins.
Which is exactly what Spurgeon attacks next. He brings up the story of Lot from the book of Genesis. When the angels are dragging Lot out of the destruction of Sodom, they tell him to flee to the mountains. But Lot looks at this small city named Zoar and pleads with the angels to let him escape there instead, using the justification, "Is it not a little one?"
We constantly use Lot's logic. We try to palliate our sin, to throw a theological gloss over it. We tell ourselves, sure, I tripped a little bit here, I lost my temper, I fudged the numbers, but I'm upright in the main. I'm fundamentally a good person with correct theology.
We excuse it so easily.
We do. But Spurgeon fires back at this with a relentless barrage of logic. He demands to know, is sin a little thing? Is it not a poison? Who among us actually knows its deadliness? And then he layers these incredibly memorable, compounding examples of how microscopic things cause massive devastation.
Like the coral insect.
Yes. He points out that a tiny, almost invisible coral insect, working unseen beneath the waves over time, can build a reef solid enough to rip the hull out of an entire navy.
He just piles the metaphors on. Little strokes, fell lofty oaks, little persistent drops of water can wear away the most solid granite.
And then he delivers the most piercing, devastating example of all to the Christian conscience. He reminds his listeners that it was a little sin eating a piece of fruit in a garden that ultimately girded the brow of Jesus Christ with a crown of thorns.
Well,
yeah, it was a little sin that forced the Son of God to endure all the cosmic anguish, the wrath, and the woe of the cross. When you weigh any sin, no matter how socially acceptable it is, in the scales of eternity and the cross, there is simply no such thing as a little sin.
it's a sobering thought.
It is. But the moment our brains convince us that there is, that unholy presumption creeps in. We begin to think we can handle it, and we confidently declare that we stand.
So we've looked at how external comforts and the gradual psychological numbing of our conscience set us up for a fall. But the architecture of presumption goes even deeper than our environment or our habits. Spurgeon moves into the deeply internal causes, the things that take root deep within the intellect and the ego of the believer. He points to this fascinating concept of devaluation, having low thoughts of the value of religion.
This is where Spurgeon makes a philosophically bold claim. He argues, essentially, that there is no such thing as religious furor, meaning excessive, irrational religious enthusiasm.
That sounds crazy to modern ears. I mean, we mock religious enthusiasm all the time. Society has a whole vocabulary for it. We call them zealots, fanatics, fundamentalists. We tell people, it's fine to have faith, just don't take it too seriously.
We do, but Spurgeon argues that logically, given the objective stakes of Christianity, it is mathematically and emotionally impossible to be too enthusiastic about God. He uses a gruesome but effective hyperbole. He says that even if a man were to be burned at the stake continuously, pouring out drops of blood and miraculously turning each drop into a new life, only to be slaughtered in perpetual, endless martyrdom, that man still would not be loving God too much.
Because of the sheer scale of what is at stake, he contrasts the unbelievably narrow, fleeting space of our earthly time with the infinite, expansive forever of eternity. If we are actually talking about immortal souls that will consciously exist forever in either the unshielded presence of God's glory or the outer darkness, how could you possibly overvalue that?
You can't. And yet, practically speaking, we consistently undervalue it every single day. To expose this, Spurgeon uses the contrast of how we care for earthly things.
Right.
He asks the audience to picture a miser. A miser takes his gold, he hides it in a vault, he locks the door, and he counts it every single night in absolute secret because he values it above all else.
He protects his investment.
Exactly. Now look at a mother with a newborn. She watches over her sick baby with an intense, agonizing, sleepless anxiety. She wouldn't just hand her vulnerable child over to a careless, unknown nurse on the street.
Right, because we obsessively protect what we value. We buy insurance for our cars, we put security systems on our houses, we monitor our credit score.
Exactly. But Christians who possess something infinitely more valuable than gold or diamonds, which Spurgeon wonderfully and dismissively describes as just small lumps of congealed air.
I love that phrase.
It's brilliant. But these Christians often carelessly and casually risk their immortal souls. They walk into temptation without a second thought. Spurgeon's point is that if we truly estimated our faith and our souls at their proper cosmic rate, we would never presume upon grace. We would guard our spiritual lives with the most anxious, vigilant care.
Small lumps of congealed air. The way he completely demystifies earthly wealth is so sharp. It's a massive perspective shift. If you actually believed that your soul was your most valuable, fragile asset, you wouldn't walk it into dangerous spiritual neighborhood, so to speak.
No, you'd guard it with your life.
But we do, which brings us to the next underlying cause. A profound ignorance of what we actually are.
And this point requires an immense amount of theological humility to swallow. Spurgeon states that we do not fully understand our own internal corruption when we are first converted. It takes years, decades even, of walking with God. The fountains of the great deep within our depraved hearts aren't broken up and revealed to us all at once.
And honestly, I'm glad it doesn't happen all at once. If God pulled back the curtain and showed us the absolute totality of our own capacity for evil on the day we were saved, we would probably be crushed into absolute despair by the weight of it.
Oh, without a doubt. And that is precisely the dynamic Spurgeon is getting at. To illustrate this progressive revelation of our own darkness, he references a chilling vision given to the prophet Ezekiel.
Oh, this is a powerful passage.
It really is. In the vision, an angel leads Ezekiel into the temple complex, opens a door, and shows him abominable, idolatrous things happening in secret. Ezekiel is horrified and thinks it's the absolute worst thing he could ever witness. But then the angel turns to him and says, "I will show thee greater abominations than these."
Just keeps getting worse.
Yeah, and he takes him deeper into the temple to another chamber and then another, each one darker and more corrupt than the last. Spurgeon applies this to the believer's journey of self-discovery. It is a progressive revelation of the human heart's near infinite capacity for evil.
There's a quote he uses here from the 18th century poet Edward Young that perfectly encapsulates this. He says, "God spares all eyes but his own, that awful sight, the vision of a human heart."
It's chilling, because if we could actually see our own hearts the way the omniscient God sees them, we would stand utterly aghast. But because we are largely ignorant of the dormant depths of our own depravity, we presume.
We think we're fine.
Right. We tell ourselves, I have a generally good nature, I have a noble disposition, I might struggle with pride, but I don't have those hot, angry, destructive passions like other people do. I would never commit that sin.
We constantly grade ourselves on a curve, usually by comparing our internal highlight reel to everyone else's public failures.
Always.
But Spurgeon quotes a mind-bending paradox from Ralph Erskine, an old Scottish minister, to shatter that illusion. Erskine wrote that a Christian is sometimes to good and evil equal bent, and both a devil and a saint.
That is incredibly jarring language.
Both a devil and a saint. It is jarring, especially for a reformed believer who emphasizes the transforming power of regeneration.
Yeah.
But Erskine and Spurgeon are driving at the biblical reality of indwelling sin, aren't they? The flesh.
Exactly.
Even in the miraculously regenerate heart, even in the person bound for heaven, the latent capacity for profound destructive evil remains active until glorification. If you walk around thinking your nature has been mostly sanitized, you let your guard down. You stop watching the perimeter.
Which throws the door wide open for the final and what Spurgeon identifies as the absolute most pregnant cause of presumption: pride. Pride, in all of its deeply camouflaged varying shapes, is the subterranean fountain of all carnal security.
And he doesn't just leave it at the word pride either. He breaks this down into three distinct, highly specific types of pride that plague the church. First, there's the pride of talent.
Oh, this one is rampant.
Right. This is the person who has been heavily endowed with natural gifts. They have a sharp, discerning mind. They can speak eloquently. They write beautifully. They analyze deeply. They look at the moral failures of others and think, well, the uneducated, the ignorant, or the emotionally volatile might fall into that trap. But look at me. I'm wrapped in intellectual grandeur. My logic will save me.
And Spurgeon notes that church history is literally littered with the wreckage of these men. He compares them to rushing comets that flamed brightly in the religious sky, drawing everyone's attention for a season, only to rush out into the cold, expansive space and be completely quenched in outer darkness.
They burned out.
They did, because they fundamentally misunderstood the nature of spiritual warfare, thinking their sheer intellect would sustain them against principalities and powers.
Then he moves to the second type, the pride of grace. Now, on its face, that sounds like an oxymoron. How in the world can someone be proud of grace? Grace, by definition, is unmerited favor.
It becomes a source of pride when a believer begins to boast in their own spiritual fruit rather than the root that produces it. A man looks at his own life and says, I have great faith, I shall never fall. My brother over there is slow, he's cold, he wrestles with doubt, he might fall, but not me.
Wow, just looking down on others.
Yeah, or they boast of their fervent love or their burning optimistic hope. Spurgeon's warning here is profound in its simplicity. He who boasts of grace has little grace to boast of.
He explains the mechanics of this error by reminding them that the stream must flow constantly from the fountainhead. If a continuous, unbroken stream of oil doesn't come to the lamp, it doesn't matter how brightly the wick is burning today. By tomorrow morning, it is going to smoke and smell terrible. You cannot store up grace like a battery and then rely on your stockpile independently of God.
And that leads into the final category of pride, which is perhaps the most insidious, blinding, and dangerous trap for the highly churched, theologically astute listener: the pride of privileges.
Okay, I have to push back here, or at least play devil's advocate for the listener who has spent years refining their theology. Isn't it an objectively good thing to be in a solid Orthodox church? To have rigorous, correct theology, to have pastors who preach the word faithfully? We've spent so much energy arguing for the necessity of these things.
It is an incredibly good thing, right? Theology is a gift, and a faithful church is a profound blessing. But, and this is a massive but, it becomes a deadly, blinding trap when you begin to rely on those external privileges for your standing, rather than relying directly on Christ.
Ah, I see the distinction.
Right. Spurgeon perfectly mimics the internal monologue of the presumptuous, highly churched man. He says, I take the sacrament regularly. I have been baptized in a strictly orthodox manner. I attend a solid, historic ministry. I am well fed on sound doctrine. If I were one of those starved, untaught creatures in a false or shallow church, I might sin, but our minister is the models of perfection. Our confession of faith is airtight. Surely, wrapped in all this correctness, we shall stand.
I think we need to linger on this for a second, because this is the exact danger of what people sometimes call cage stage Calvinism, or the trap of overly intellectualizing the faith.
Oh, absolutely.
Having the right answers on paper, having the most robust, systematic theology on your bookshelf, and actually trick your brain into thinking that your heart is in utter submission to God. We conflate our intellectual grasp of doctrine with actual spiritual maturity. We mistake our solid, orthodox, reformed theology for breathing, vibrant spiritual vitality.
It's a deadly substitution.
It is. Because the pride of privileges allows you to look down your nose at the starved creatures in other denominations, dissecting their theological errors, all while you yourself are secretly becoming carnal, cold, and utterly secure in your own arrogance.
It is a devastating self-deception. Pride, as Spurgeon concludes in this section, is the worm at the root of the gourd. It silently eats away the life of the plant from underground. It destroys even the most intellectually equipped, well-fed Christian because it severs their conscious dependence on God.
So, we've thoroughly excavated the 5 underlying causes: the intoxicating effect of prosperity, the gradual numbing of the conscience to little sins, the undervaluation of the soul, the ignorance of our own depravity, and the multi-headed hydra of pride. Now, we have to follow Spurgeon as he shifts the focus. We are moving from the invisible causes of presumption to the highly visible active dangers it produces in a believer's daily life.
This is where it gets really practical.
Right. The driving question now is, why is the presumptuous man, armed with all this false security, so much more likely to actually experience a catastrophic fall than anyone else?
Spurgeon gives us 4 distinct escalating dangers. These are the behavioral consequences of presumption. Danger number 1 is carelessness in battle.
Which makes perfect psychological sense. If you manage to convince a man that he is completely invincible, what is his very first reaction? He gets sloppy. He stops practicing.
Exactly. Spurgeon paints this vivid picture of a strong man in the middle of a thickening, chaotic fight. The enemy forces are approaching, the battle lines are drawn, but this man leaves his sword resting in the scabbard. Or worse, he just lies down in his tent to take a nap.
Unbelievable.
His internal monologue is, my arm is so strong, my skills are so superior that whenever I actually meet my enemies, I'll just casually draw my sword and mow them down. I don't need to prepare.
He assumes he can just turn his spiritual prowess on and off like a light switch at will. I don't need to stay on guard. I'm a giant among men.
And Spurgeon reaches into the biblical narrative to find the ultimate archetype of arrogant carelessness, Goliath.
Oh, that's perfect.
Right. Think about the mechanics of that famous battle. Goliath was an absolute giant, heavily armored from head to toe, holding weapons of massive destruction. He was entirely confident in his size, his experience, and his armor. So confident, in fact, that he casually lifted up his helmet visor to mock the shepherd boy walking toward him.
Exposed himself.
He needlessly exposed his forehead. And that small, arrogant exposure is exactly where the smooth stone pierced him. The presumptuous man falls not because he lacks armor, but because he thinks he's so untouchable that he forgets to wear it. He isn't prepared to parry the sudden stroke of the evil one.
And that arrogance leads directly into the next danger, which is significantly worse than mere carelessness. Not only are they sloppy when the battle comes to them, they actively, intentionally run out into temptation. They seek it out.
They invite it.
Yeah. And Spurgeon shares a very specific, deeply revealing pastoral anecdote from his own life to illustrate this.
Yes. He recounts a face-to-face confrontation with a professing Christian, someone he actually knew, who was heading into a place of worldly amusement, a place characterized by vice and the profaning of God's name. Spurgeon, acting as a faithful pastor, calls out to him, using a pointed biblical reference, "What doest thou there, Elijah?"
Which is the exact question God asked the prophet Elijah when Elijah was hiding in a cave, running from Jezebel, completely out of the position God had assigned him.
Right. It's a call to account. And the man's defense is fascinating. He doesn't deny where he is going, and he doesn't seem ashamed. Instead, he boldly tells Spurgeon, "I can do that with impunity." He claims he has been to this place before. He's somehow managed to have some sweet spiritual thoughts while there. And he actually argues that engaging with this worldly amusement enlarges the intellect.
He attempts to intellectualize his sin. He actually flips the script and calls Spurgeon narrow-minded and rigid. He tells him, "You don't get these good things. It's a rich treat to engage with the culture this way." And Spurgeon responds with blunt honesty. "No, it's a place of severe danger. The name of Jesus is routinely profaned there. I wouldn't dare go there because I know my own heart and I know I would commit sin."
But the man stubbornly insists, "I am a strong man. I can go without being affected."
And what was Spurgeon's immediate diagnostic conclusion about this man?
He says the man was an apple of Sodom. This is a reference to a legendary mythical fruit said to grow near the Dead Sea. According to the legend, the fruit looked incredibly beautiful, ripe, and luscious on the outside, but the moment you bit into it or crushed it in your hand, it exploded into bitter dust and ashes.
That's quite an image.
It is. Spurgeon says he guessed right then and there that there was something fundamentally rotten at the core of this man's life. And history proved him right, because the man ultimately turned out to be a downright sensualist, a hypocrite who wore a theological mask to cover his fleshly desires.
This exchange establishes a critical diagnostic principle for all believers. Self-confident men read their own moral strength backwards.
That's a great way to put it.
Right. When a man boasts that he is so incredibly good, so spiritually robust, that he can freely walk into the blazing fires of temptation without getting burned, Spurgeon says you should read his words entirely backwards.
You should understand him to mean that he is actually as bad and as weak as a person can possibly be. Because true grace, genuine spiritual maturity, always makes a person flee temptation, not play games with it. If you think you are strong enough to pet a lion, you are already bleeding.
Precisely. Which brings us to the third behavioral danger, neglecting the means of grace.
Because the presumptuous man thinks he is simply too advanced, too mature for the basics of the Christian life. Spurgeon points out that there are people who are accepted in churches as true children of God, but they make a regular habit of staying away from the gathering of the saints. They think they no longer need the communal preaching of the word.
They isolate themselves.
They do. They boast of a deep, private, internal, mystical experience. They think, I have a volume of incredibly sweet, profound Puritan sermons sitting on my desk at home. I'll just read those. I don't need to go sit in a pew and listen to a modern pastor.
They think they can survive on old food.
Exactly. They imagine that the spiritual food they consumed and digested 7 years ago is somehow sufficient to sustain the vital functions of their soul for the next 10 years.
They stop partaking in the Lord's table. They stop spending agonizing dependent time in their prayer closets. They stop desperately searching the scriptures for daily manna. Spurgeon uses this incredibly stark, painful imagery to describe this state. He says they are choosing to walk barefoot over jagged flint because they arrogantly refuse to put on the shoes of grace provided for them.
And then they act surprised when they're hurt.
Right. They have the audacity to wonder why their feet are cut to ribbons. They refuse to put on the heavy armor, and so the enemy easily wounds them well nigh unto death.
It is the deep, suffocating quagmire of neglect. And that neglect ultimately leads to the final and unequivocally the most terrifying danger of them all, the fourth danger. The spirit leaves the proud.
This is the part of the message that should make every single listener hold their breath.
It absolutely should. Spurgeon points out a beautiful, consistent biblical pattern regarding the Holy Spirit. He notes that the Spirit, symbolized by the gracious, peaceful dove, delights to dwell in low, humble places.
The valleys.
Yes. He reminds the congregation that the dove came down upon Christ at the Jordan River, a low-lying valley. We do not read that the dove rested on the towering, majestic heights of Bashan. The Spirit of God was seen moving among the humble myrtle trees at the foot of the mountains, not among the lofty, arrogant cedars reaching for the sky on the summit.
God is magnetically drawn to humility. The person who walks with fear and trembling, who is acutely, painfully aware of their own weakness, and who is constantly, desperately leaning their entire weight on Christ, that is the man or woman the Spirit loves to comfort and dwell with.
But when pride creeps into the heart, when a man crosses his arms and declares, "I am in no danger, I have this handled," the dove takes flight. God's Spirit utterly abhors the arrogant, self-sufficient, independent spirit of Lucifer. He will not tarry in its company. He withdraws his sensible presence, his active comfort, and his restraining grace.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, if we take a step back and look at these four dangers together, you can see how they form this tragic, accelerating downward spiral.
It really is a spiral.
Yeah. It starts internally with laziness. You leave your sword in the scabbard. That laziness breeds an unchecked arrogance where you start actively flirting with sin and running out into temptation to prove your strength. Because you think you're strong, you naturally abandon your spiritual nourishment. You stop praying. You stop gathering with believers because you don't think you need the help. And the ultimate, devastating result of that neglect is the terrifying loss of the Holy Spirit's active, protective presence in your life. You are left entirely to your own devices.
It is the complete systemic unraveling of a believer's defenses.
It makes me think of the psychology of a seasoned deep-sea diver. Imagine someone who has been diving in extreme environments for 20 years. They know the equipment inside and out. They understand the crushing depths. They can read the unpredictable ocean currents.
They're pros.
Total pros. But one day, they wake up and decide they don't need to run through their tedious 40-point pre-dive safety checklist anymore. They don't need to meticulously check the O-rings on their oxygen tanks or calibrate their pressure gauges because, well, they've done 100 deep dives successfully.
That's a huge mistake.
They think, I'm a master diver, my instincts will keep me safe. That exact moment of presumption, that precise second they stop acting like a vulnerable beginner who is entirely dependent on the equipment for their very survival, is exactly when the fatal mistake happens. The ocean is utterly indifferent to your past successes. It doesn't care about your resume. If you dive without oxygen, the pressure will crush you.
That is a phenomenal parallel. The presumptuous Christian fundamentally forgets that their spiritual survival is entirely dependent on the continuous, unbroken supply of God's grace, just like that diver depends on the oxygen tank. The moment you think you can breathe underwater on your own, you are seconds away from drowning.
And this sobering reality brings us into the final section of our exploration today. We are transitioning into Spurgeon's dire pastoral warnings about the actual lived consequences of falling, because he is very clear. Even within the framework of Reformed theology, even for the eternally secure Christian whose salvation cannot be lost, the earthly and spiritual consequences of a catastrophic moral fall are absolutely devastating.
They really are.
We have to look at the reality of the fall for the individual and then the collateral damage it does to the reputation of the gospel.
Spurgeon invites the listener into a chilling metaphorical space here. He says, "Could I take thee into the wards of that hospital where lie sick and wounded Christians? I could make you tremble."
Now, to be clear, he is not talking about people who lost their salvation and are condemned to hell. He's talking about the elect, the redeemed, who have completely shattered their lives through presumption.
Yes, exactly. He walks us through the beds in this spiritual hospital. He points to a man who, by a sin that occupied him for only a single fleeting moment, is now so broken that his entire earthly life is one continued scene of misery and regret.
Oh, breaking.
It is. He points to another who is a brilliant genius, uniquely gifted by God to preach and write, who now sits in the shadows in absolute despair, his usefulness destroyed. He points to another who still manages to come to the church, but he sits in a remote corner, his head bowed in shame, treated with lingering suspicion by the brethren because his his previous fall so greatly deceived and wounded them.
He describes these fallen believers as having soared with Icarian wings, like the Greek myth of Icarus, who arrogantly flew too close to the sun with wings made of wax and feathers. These presumptuous Christians flew up into the airy, thinning regions of self-confidence and spiritual pride. The heat of reality melted their wax, and now they lie shattered at the foot of the mountain with their bones broken and their peace of mind utterly destroyed.
And this is where Spurgeon brings in the intense biblical concept of being saved so as by fire, referencing Paul's teaching in 1 Corinthians 3. He draws a vivid contrast between two types of Christians arriving at the gates of heaven.
I was deeply struck by the contrast he draws here at the end. It is a haunting piece of imagery. Explain how he differentiates the two journeys.
Well, he describes one man who walks the path to heaven, keeping a consistent, humble watch over his soul. God's sensible presence is with him. He experiences deep joy on his journey, and when he finally reaches the end of his life, he drinks the sweet nectar of the stream of death and enters the gates of heaven singing triumphant songs of victory.
That sounds wonderful.
It's the ideal. But the other man, the presumptuous man, refuses to stay on the path. He runs aside into the brush to casually pluck a flower of temptation. While he is out there, he gets caught in a gin, a violent trap laid by the devil. He is battered, bruised, and spiritually impoverished. And when this man finally comes to the river of death, instead of a peaceful stream of nectar, he is confronted with a river that is literally on fire.
Blazing with the temporal consequences of his own sin.
Yes. And as he enters it, he is scorched and burned. He is not lost because God's covenant is unbreakable, but the hand of God has to reach down, clutch him by the hair of his head, and physically drag him through the flames. He stands on the golden shores of heaven, eternally saved, but smelling of smoke, crying out, "I am a monument of divine mercy, for I have been saved so as by fire." Spurgeon looks at his congregation of thousands and asks a piercing question. Do you want to be saved by fire? Do you want to be dragged through the flames of your own ruined life? Or would you rather walk the path of humility and enter heaven singing praises?
That completely shatters the lazy accusation that eternal security means consequences don't matter. Yes, the sovereign hand of God will never let you perish if you belong to him, but being dragged by the hair through a blazing river of fire of your own making is certainly not the way you want to finish the race.
And the tragedy of presumption extends far beyond the individual believer's pain and broken bones. The second massive consequence of a fall is the collateral damage it inflicts on the cause of Christ in the world.
Spurgeon states plainly that nothing has hurt the cause of religion 1,000th part so much as the public falls of God's people. When a prominent believer falls, or when a church leader is exposed in a scandal, the secular world doesn't mourn. They don't offer grace. They exult.
They love it.
They chuckle with grim satisfaction. He quotes the prophet Zechariah. Rejoice, fir tree, for the cedar has fallen. The unbelieving world constantly flies around the church like a predator, looking for one vulnerable point, one chink in the armor. And when they finally find it, they point and say, "See, these holy people are no better than they should be. It's all a sham."
Because of one high-profile hypocrite, the world feels justified in dismissing the entire Christian faith. Spurgeon notes that a man once told him he didn't believe there was a single true Christian living on earth because he had encountered so many hypocrites in the church.
But Spurgeon gives such a brilliant, airtight, logical counter to that cynical argument. He says, think about economics. No one would ever waste their time trying to forge banknotes if there were no genuine banknotes in circulation.
Exactly.
No one bothers to pass a bad counterfeit sovereign if there isn't sterling valuable coin to imitate. The very existence of hypocrites and counterfeits actually proves the undeniable existence of genuine valuable believers.
That is classic Spurgeon logic, toning the skeptic's argument completely in on itself. But he takes this defense a step further, and this is where he vigorously, passionately defends his specific theological camp against its critics. He directly addresses the slander leveled against his denomination and against Reformed theology in general.
Right, because the constant historical accusation against high doctrines, meaning Calvinism, the doctrines of grace, unconditional election, and eternal security, is that these doctrines naturally lead to antinomianism, or licentious, sinful living.
Yeah, that's the classic charge.
The Arminian argument is always, if you tell people they are saved entirely by grace and nothing they do can ever lose it, they'll just live however they want. You are giving them a license to sin.
This raises an important question about the actual historical fruit of theology, and Spurgeon tackles it head-on. He doesn't just argue theory, he invokes the witness of history. He asks the crowd, who are the men who have been the great towering exponents of this system of sovereign grace?
And who does he list?
He lists them. Augustine, John Calvin, George Whitefield, the Puritans. And then he asks a question that silences the critics. Where in all of human history will you find holier, better, more devoted men than these?
He argues that the people who believe they are saved entirely by free grace and not by a single ounce of their own works are actually the ones who live the closest to God.
This is the absolute crux of the Reformed defense against the charge of presumption. True, heart-level belief in unconditional free grace does not lead to careless sin. On the contrary, it is the exact mechanism that produces the most disinterested piety and the sublimest reverence.
It changes the heart.
It does. When a person truly realizes that they contributed absolutely nothing to their salvation except the sin that made it necessary, and that the holy God of the universe saved them purely out of his unmerited electing love, it doesn't make them want to rebel. It shatters their pride.
It breaks them.
It breaks their heart in the best, most beautiful way possible. It binds them to Christ in a state of profound gratitude, holy fear, and vigilant love.
So what does this all mean? It is the realization that grace is not a license. It is a tether. And so we have to bring this incredible weight of truth down to where we live. What does this all mean for you, the listener, navigating your own life this week? Spurgeon is begging you through the echoes of history to consider not just your own soul, not just avoiding the broken bones and the hospital wards of the presumptuous. He is pleading with you to consider the reputation of Christ in your community, in your workplace, in your home. Are you, through subtle compromises, through slowly adjusting to the background noise of the shipyard, giving the watching world a reason to slander the gospel? Or does your life have the undeniable weighty ring of true gold?
And that profound challenge leads directly to his final plea, because after preaching this incredibly intense, surgical, diagnostic message to the believers in the room, he suddenly turns his attention to the dry bones in the valley.
The unbelievers, the people sitting in Exeter Hall who know deep down that they do not possess the genuine coin of faith at all. They're holding nothing but the base metal of the pit.
He stops trying to persuade them morally. He knows that trying to get an unbeliever to stop being presumptuous is like asking a dead man to run a marathon. He says to them, I ask ye not to get the flour before you have the seed. I will not bid you get the roof of your house before you lay the foundation.
What does he do?
He just gives them the raw, unadorned, desperately simple gospel call.
He thunders out the ancient promise. Believe on the name of the Lord Jesus Christ, and you shall be saved. He tells the crowd that whoever will cast himself as a guilty, helpless worm flat on the finished work of Jesus, whoever will abandon their pride and throw themselves entirely into the arms of everlasting love, that man shall be accepted. He will walk out the doors of Exeter Hall justified, forgiven, and as eternally safe as if he were already walking the streets of heaven.
It is a beautiful, urgent, and deeply compassionate evangelistic close. He strips away all the complexity and reminds them of the terrifying shortness of time and the unavoidable reality of eternity.
It is the perfect, gospel-soaked ending to an otherwise heavy diagnostic sermon. Because ultimately, the cure for presumption isn't pulling yourself up by your bootstraps or trying harder to be vigilant, it's falling flat on Jesus. Whether you are a believer of 50 years who has slowly fallen asleep on the mast of prosperity, or someone who doesn't know Christ at all and is drowning in the sea, the remedy is the exact same.
Look away from yourself.
Look to Christ. Rely entirely on his grace, not your own fluctuating strength.
Let him that thinketh he standeth take heed lest he fall. And the only true way to take heed is to constantly, humbly recognize that you cannot possibly stand on your own.
We have covered a tremendous amount of ground today. We've waded through the muddy diagnostic waters of the human heart. We've traced the counterfeit coins of the devil's mint. We've exposed the deeply hidden dangers of spiritual pride, and we've analyzed the terrifying, lulling effect of worldly comfort. But as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with one final, lingering thought to mull over as you go about your week.
Let's hear it.
Based on everything we've unpacked from Spurgeon's masterful X-ray of the soul today, well, if our greatest spiritual danger is actually hidden within our own sense of comfort, our success, and our perceived stability, how might an unexpected hardship, a sudden painful loss, or a deeply frustrating obstacle that you're experiencing right now in your life actually be the most profound act of divine rescue you could possibly receive today?
That is a deeply disruptive yet incredibly hopeful question worth wrestling with.
Because maybe the storm you're facing isn't there to destroy your ship. Maybe the storm was sovereignly sent to wake you up before you fall off the mast. Keep your eyes outward. Keep leaning on grace. We'll see you next time.